April 24th, 1941. Thermopylae Pass, Central Greece. 0430 hours. The darkness before dawn lay heavy across the narrow mountain corridor where, more than 2,000 years earlier, another outnumbered force had made its stand. Low clouds pressed against the ridges. The ground was damp from night rain. The smell of churned earth mixed with cordite and burned scrub from the previous day's bombardment. In shallow, hastily dug positions along the road and up the rocky slopes, Australian soldiers of the 6th Division waited. Their uniforms were stained with mud and sweat. Most had not slept properly in days. Faces were unshaven. Rifles rested across sandbags. Ammunition was stacked carefully, counted and recounted in the dark. Behind them, beyond the hills and olive groves, tens of thousands of British and Commonwealth troops were moving south toward evacuation beaches near Porto Rafti. Trucks rolled through the night without headlights. Columns marched in silence. The withdrawal had been steady and relentless. The Australians had been ordered to stop here. At 0445 hours, the first sound carried through the valley. A low mechanical growl that did not belong to the countryside. It echoed off the rock walls and grew louder by the minute. Panzer engines. Every man in the line understood what that sound meant. The same armoured formations that had torn through Poland in 1939. The same divisions that had broken France in weeks. The same methodical advance that had shattered Yugoslavia earlier that month. Now they were coming through this pass. The mission had been delivered without decoration. Hold the line for 24 hours. Delay the German advance long enough for the evacuation to continue. No promise of reinforcement, no promise of relief. Only time, measured in hours, that had to be bought. The numbers were plain. Roughly 2,000 Australians facing elements of an entire German division pushing south. If the line collapsed too soon, thousands of men on the beaches would be trapped in daylight, exposed to air attack and capture. An officer crouched beside a Bren gun team and spoke quietly to the man next to him. "Thermopylae," he said. Again. There was no laughter. The comparison did not need explanation. The ground itself carried the weight of history. A narrow pass between mountains and sea. An army holding against greater numbers. A delaying action, not a battle for conquest. But unlike the ancient Spartans, these men were not ordered to die to the last. They were ordered to hold, and, if possible, to get out. At 0500 hours, a distant artillery round thudded into the hillside north of the line. Then another. The Germans were testing range. Australian signallers passed messages by field telephone. Final checks were made. Anti-tank guns were positioned to cover the road where armour would have to pass. Infantry sections fixed bayonets and waited for the barrage that would signal the beginning. The sky began to pale. Mist drifted through the lower ground, half hiding the winding road. For a brief moment, the valley seemed almost peaceful. Birds stirred in the scrub. The sea lay calm beyond the coastal bend. Then the first full salvo landed. Earth lifted into the air. Rock fragments tore through sandbags. Men pressed flat into their shallow trenches as shells walked methodically along the line. The battle for time had begun. They were not expected to win. They were expected to endure. And somewhere behind them, thousands of retreating soldiers were depending on that endurance to survive the day. The Balkans campaign, Hitler's unplanned war. The road to Thermopylae had begun months earlier, far from Greece. On October 28, 1940, Italian forces under Benito Mussolini crossed from Albania into Greece. Rome expected a swift campaign. Instead, the attack stalled within days. Greek troops counterattacked with determination, pushing the Italians back into Albanian territory through winter conditions that punished both sides. What was meant to demonstrate Axis strength exposed weakness. By early 1941, the situation had become a problem for Berlin. Adolf Hitler had not intended to fight in the Balkans that spring. His strategic focus was eastward. Plans for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, were already underway. But instability on Germany's southern flank threatened those plans. Italy's faltering campaign tied down Axis resources. British aircraft began operating from Greek airfields, bringing the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești within potential bombing range. That alone was unacceptable to Germany's war economy. In March 1941, events accelerated. A coup in Yugoslavia overturned a government that had aligned with the Axis. Hitler responded immediately. German forces invaded Yugoslavia on April 6th. The campaign lasted only 11 days. Belgrade fell. Yugoslav resistance collapsed. The same day, German formations crossed into northern Greece from Bulgaria under Operation Marita. The British government, determined to support Greece, had already committed troops. Approximately 62,000 British, Australian, and New Zealand soldiers were dispatched. Many came from formations that had recently fought in North Africa. Equipment was limited. Anti-tank capacity was insufficient. Air cover was thin. The Allied defensive plan relied on holding successive lines through mountainous terrain. But the German advance was rapid and coordinated. Panzer divisions exploited gaps. Luftwaffe aircraft struck roads, bridges, and troop concentrations. Communications faltered under pressure. Within 2 weeks, the defensive structure in northern Greece fractured. The German breakthrough through Yugoslavia allowed armoured units to swing south and threaten encirclement. The risk was clear. Allied forces in Greece could be cut off entirely. General Sir Archibald Wavell, commanding British forces in the Middle East, faced a difficult decision: continue a collapsing defence and risk capture of the entire expeditionary force, or withdraw while evacuation remained possible. The order to evacuate was given. The operation resembled the earlier withdrawal from Dunkirk, though on a smaller scale and under different conditions. Ports in southern Greece became embarkation points. Naval vessels would lift troops to Crete and Egypt. But evacuation required time: nights without air attack, organised embarkation, steady movement south. Time was what the Allies did not possess. German mechanised units were advancing quickly down the main routes. If they reached the beaches before evacuation concluded, tens of thousands could be captured. A final defensive line was required. Thermopylae offered natural advantages. A narrow corridor between mountains and sea limited manoeuvre space. Armour would be forced onto predictable routes. Infantry could anchor high ground overlooking the road. But the position could only delay, not reverse, the outcome. Strategically, the task was simple to describe and difficult to execute. Hold long enough for ships to arrive and depart safely. Each additional hour the line stood meant more men boarding transports in darkness. Each hour lost meant thousands at risk. For Germany, speed was essential. A decisive breakthrough could trap the British Commonwealth force and deliver a significant political and military blow. Capturing the Expeditionary Army would remove experienced formations from future campaigns in North Africa and beyond. Thus, the pass at Thermopylae became more than a geographical feature. It became the hinge between evacuation and catastrophe. The campaign in Greece would not decide the war, but the survival of trained divisions might. In that narrow strip of ground, the larger strategic calculation was reduced to a single requirement: delay the German advance, at any cost, until the fleet had done its work. Brigadier Harold "Tubby" Allen and the 6th Division Rearguard Command of the Thermopylae Rearguard rested with Brigadier Harold Edward "Tubby" Allen, a professional soldier approaching his 50th year. He was not a dramatic figure. He spoke plainly, avoided unnecessary display, and carried himself with the calm of a man who had already seen one war in full. During the First World War, he had served on the Western Front, earning distinction in battles such as Pozieres and Passchendaele. He understood attrition. He understood what it meant to hold ground under artillery fire while casualty lists lengthened by the hour. Those experiences shaped the way he assessed Thermopylae. He did not imagine glory. He calculated endurance. Under his authority were elements of the Australian 6th Division, including the 16th and 19th Infantry Brigades. Many of the men were volunteers who had enlisted in 1939 and 1940. They came from rural towns and working districts, farmers from Victoria, shearers from Queensland, labourers and clerks from New South Wales. Few had known Greece existed before the war. They had already seen combat in North Africa. At Bardia and Tobruk earlier in 1941, Australian formations helped defeat Italian forces in a series of sharp engagements. Confidence had grown from those victories. Yet Greece was different. Here they faced German armoured units supported by coordinated air power. Among Allen's battalion commanders were Lieutenant Colonel Theo Walker of the 2/4th Battalion and officers leading the 2/8th Battalion positioned along the higher ground. These were capable, experienced leaders, respected by their men. They were accustomed to improvisation, used to operating with limited resources. The soldiers themselves carried a reputation within the British Army. They were known as diggers, a term rooted in earlier conflicts. Discipline in barracks could be relaxed, sometimes to the irritation of British regular officers. In battle, however, their performance was steady and often aggressive. By late April 1941, exhaustion showed plainly. For 3 weeks, the division had been in near constant movement, advancing, withdrawing, digging new positions, abandoning them under pressure. Luftwaffe aircraft had dominated the skies. Stuka dive bombers had become a familiar and unwelcome presence, striking roads and columns during daylight. Sleep came in fragments. Meals were irregular. Equipment was worn. Yet Allen's orders were precise. The force at Thermopylae was to hold for 24 hours to protect the evacuation to the south. Not an indefinite stand. Not symbolic resistance. A defined period measured against the timetable of naval operations. He communicated the task clearly. The objective was delay, not annihilation. Once the required time had passed, withdrawal would follow if circumstances allowed. The men understood the implication. They were positioned as a shield for thousands moving behind them. Success would not be judged by captured ground or destroyed enemy formations, but by ships leaving harbour filled with troops. There was little illusion about the odds. German units advancing toward the pass included armoured elements and experienced infantry fresh from the Balkan offensive. The Australians lacked equivalent armour and had no air cover. Their strength lay in cohesion, terrain, and determination. Some soldiers remarked quietly on the historical weight of their location. The comparison to the ancient battle was unavoidable. But unlike legend, this was a modern conflict governed by logistics, timetables, and wireless signals. Allen reviewed his maps without sentiment. He studied fields of fire, approaches for armour, fallback routes. He considered where anti-tank guns could inflict maximum delay. He calculated how long ammunition might last under sustained assault. In him, the responsibility converged. If the line broke too soon, thousands would be stranded. If he held too long, his own force risked encirclement. Between those outcomes lay 24 hours that would define the rearguard's role in the campaign. Allen did not speak of sacrifice. He spoke of time. And the men under his command prepared to trade what they had for it. Hold until midnight, against an entire panzer division. At first light on April 24th, reconnaissance aircraft circled above the pass and confirmed what German headquarters had anticipated. The Allied force had chosen Thermopylae as its final defensive position before the evacuation routes. Shortly afterward, Australian Command received updated intelligence. Advancing south were elements of the German 5th Panzer Division, supported by motorised infantry and SS formations. In total, the attacking force outnumbered the Australian rearguard several times over and possessed full armoured capability. Against roughly 2,000 Australians stood a formation numbering in the many thousands, equipped with tanks, artillery, and reliable air support. The defensive line extended nearly 8 kilometres from the coastal road to the mountain slopes inland. It was longer than the available manpower justified. Thinly held sectors were unavoidable. Several weaknesses were already apparent. Ammunition stocks were limited. After weeks of retreat and fighting, resupply had been inconsistent. Some companies possessed only enough small arms ammunition for a few hours of sustained engagement. Anti-tank rounds were carefully rationed. There would be no opportunity to replenish once battle began. The anti-tank defense itself was modest. Only a small number of functioning guns covered the approaches. Mines had been laid earlier, but no reserves remained to reinforce breaches. Once a gap opened, plugging it would depend entirely on infantry action. Artillery support was absent. Field guns had been withdrawn south to avoid capture. Without them, the Australians lacked the ability to disrupt German concentrations before an assault. They would have to absorb the initial blows at close range. Air cover was non-existent. The Royal Air Force had already redeployed its remaining aircraft to Crete. German dive bombers and reconnaissance planes operated freely. Daylight movement was hazardous. Any attempt at reinforcement or withdrawal under the sun would invite attack from above. The geography offered partial compensation. The pass narrowed between steep hills and the coastline, restricting large-scale maneuver. Tanks would be forced onto the road or onto predictable ground near it. Infantry attempting to climb the rocky slopes would be exposed to defenders positioned above. But the same terrain carried a disadvantage. There was no substantial secondary line behind Thermopylae. If the position fractured, retreat routes would compress quickly. Withdrawal under pressure could become chaotic. Communication was another concern. Field telephones connected key points, yet these lines were vulnerable to shell fire. Wireless sets were limited and often unreliable in mountainous terrain. Once contact with a sector was lost, commanders might not know whether it still held. Headquarters in the south transmitted a direct message. The evacuation timetable was running behind schedule. Naval vessels could approach the beaches only after nightfall due to Luftwaffe dominance. The rearguard was required to maintain the line until midnight at minimum. If possible, longer. The arithmetic was stark. Each hour gained would allow thousands more troops to embark safely. Each hour lost might expose them in daylight to air attack or encirclement. Within the Australian ranks, awareness of the stakes was clear. If the line failed prematurely, as many as 30,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers moving toward the coast could be trapped between advancing armour and the sea. Capture would be likely. Casualties would follow. The rearguard's task was therefore not measured in territorial success. It was measured in delay. Some soldiers expressed the reality in practical terms. They were not positioned to defeat the German division outright. They were there to make its progress costly and slow. To be, as one man remarked, expensive. As the morning advanced and artillery registration rounds began to fall closer to the trenches, the shape of the problem settled over the line. Hold an extended front, with limited ammunition, without artillery or aircraft, against armoured formations advancing with momentum, and do so long enough for ships to arrive unseen in darkness. There would be no margin for collapse, only endurance until the clock permitted movement. Midnight had become the measure of survival. Dawn to dusk, the long days dying. At 0630 hours, the German artillery barrage began in earnest. Shells from 88mm guns and field pieces landed along the Australian line with deliberate precision. The ground shook continuously. Rock splintered. Dust and smoke filled trenches that had been dug only hours earlier. Men pressed into the earth, hands over helmets, waiting for the bombardment to lift. For 45 minutes, the Australians could do little except endure. Telephone lines were cut in several places within the first quarter hour. Runners were dispatched across exposed ground to restore communication. Casualties mounted before the infantry assault had even started. At 0715, the barrage shifted deeper into the pass. Through drifting smoke, the shapes of German tanks emerged on the coastal road. Panzer III and IV vehicles advanced cautiously, infantry riding behind in half-tracks. Engines echoed against the mountains. Australian anti-tank gunners waited until the range closed. At roughly 400 metres, the first gun fired. The leading tank halted, smoke pouring from its hull. A second round struck another vehicle behind it. Within minutes, 3 panzers were disabled, their blackened frames blocking part of the road. But the column did not stop. German armour manoeuvred around the wrecks, while infantry dismounted and moved forward under covering fire. On the mountain flank, where terrain restricted tank movement, German infantry attempted to climb toward the 2nd 8th Battalion's positions. The ascent was steep and exposed. Rifle and Bren gunfire forced them to ground repeatedly. Several assaults stalled before reaching the crest. By 0830, pressure increased along the coastal sector. German armour exploited a thinner stretch of the line, using suppressing fire to create a breach. Lieutenant Colonel Walker committed his small reserve company to stabilise the position. Fighting there became close and chaotic. Australian soldiers, armed with grenades and improvised anti-tank measures, closed with advancing vehicles at short range. Casualties were heavy. The narrow road became cluttered with burning wreckage and damaged transport. The line bent. It did not collapse. Midday brought new strain. Between 1200 and 1400 hours, Luftwaffe aircraft arrived overhead. Stuka dive bombers descended with sirens wailing, releasing bombs against visible strongpoints and road junctions. Without anti-aircraft cover, the Australians could only take shelter in slit trenches and hope the bombs missed their mark. Explosions severed additional communication lines. For nearly 2 hours, portions of the eastern sector fought without direct contact with brigade headquarters. Ammunition consumption accelerated. Some companies reported fewer than 60 rounds per rifleman remaining. Fire discipline tightened. Officers instructed their men to hold shots until targets were certain. At 1500 hours, German commanders escalated the assault. SS infantry units advanced in coordinated waves against the mountain positions. The engagement shifted to close quarters. Several forward trenches were temporarily overrun. Bayonets, rifle butts, and entrenching tools were used where space was too confined for manoeuvre. An immediate counterattack restored parts of the ridge, but losses were severe. Companies that had begun the day near full strength were reduced by nearly half. As afternoon progressed toward evening, exhaustion deepened. Medical orderlies worked in shell craters, serving as improvised aid posts. Morphine supplies diminished. Wounded who could still walk were directed rearward. Others remained where they fell until darkness might allow movement. By 1700 hours, reports to Brigadier Allen painted a consistent picture. Ammunition was critically low across multiple sectors. Some anti-tank guns had exhausted their specialized rounds. Riflemen were instructed to conserve cartridges for close engagement. Yet German pressure continued. At 1830 hours, a coordinated push unfolded along the entire front. Armour pressed again on the coastal road, while infantry probed both flanks. Smoke and dust obscured visibility as the sun dipped lower over the Aegean. One German tank column advanced within 200 meters of brigade headquarters before being disabled by a concealed gun firing its last effective rounds. On the heights, positions changed hands more than once. Sections were reduced to handfuls of men holding fragmented trenches. Reinforcements consisted of clerks, signallers, and cooks handed rifles and directed forward. As dusk approached, the tempo began to slow. German units, not fully equipped for night operations, consolidated gains rather than launching uncontrolled advances into darkness. By 1945 hours, firing lessened across most sectors. Allen checked his watch. The line had held through 13.5 hours of sustained attack. Casualties were heavy. Ammunition was nearly exhausted, but the position remained in Australian hands. Behind them, on the southern beaches, the first destroyers were approaching under cover of darkness. The day had not broken the rearguard. The more difficult hours still lay ahead. Midnight at Thermopylae. Now, get out or die here. At 2100 hours, the night sky above the pass was broken by white flares. German commanders had recognized the pattern. The stubborn defense, the controlled withdrawal of rear elements, the continued resistance despite mounting losses. It signaled an evacuation in progress. One final concentrated assault was ordered to shatter the rearguard before it could disengage. Illumination rounds drifted downward, turning darkness into a pale, shifting twilight. Tanks advanced again along the coastal road, infantry clinging to their hulls for cover. Machine guns fired in sustained bursts. Mortar rounds landed among thinning Australian positions. The sound rolled continuously through the narrow valley. Australian units responded with what ammunition remained. Tracer rounds cut across the night in brief arcs of red and green. Anti-tank guns fired sparingly, crews waiting until silhouettes were unmistakable. Riflemen aimed deliberately. There was no margin for waste. On the left flank of the 4th Battalion, pressure intensified. German armour forced a partial breach, infantry following through the gap. Close combat erupted in trenches only metres apart. In the confusion of smoke and flare light, identification was uncertain. Orders were shouted at close range. Lieutenant Colonel Walker moved forward to direct the defence personally. With a small group of men, he organised a counterattack to seal the breach. The clash was immediate and brutal. Bayonets and grenades decided the matter where rifle fire could not. Walker was wounded in the exchange, but refused evacuation while the line remained engaged. The position stabilised, though at reduced strength. At 22:30 hours, a signal reached Brigadier Allen from the evacuation command. The schedule had advanced. Ships were loading more rapidly than expected. The message was direct: begin withdrawal at once. The decision Allen faced was stark. Disengaging from an enemy pressing within grenade range required coordination under fire. A disorderly retreat would lead to encirclement or destruction. Yet remaining too long risked losing the opportunity to reach the beaches before dawn. Allen issued orders for a staged withdrawal. Coastal companies were to break contact first and move south in small groups. Mountain units would maintain pressure for an additional period before pulling back. Rear sections would cover movement in sequence, leapfrogging toward the rear. The first element slipped away shortly after 22:45 hours. Movement was slow and deliberate at first. Then German patrols detected the shift. Machine guns reopened. Flares rose again. Mortars targeted suspected routes. Men moved through olive groves and shallow ravines, carrying wounded when possible. Some injured soldiers who could not walk were left with water and ammunition, knowing capture was inevitable. On the heights, Major Langley's reduced companies remained engaged until near 23:15 hours. Ammunition was nearly gone. The order to withdraw passed quietly from section to section. They fired final controlled volleys to suppress nearby German positions. Then they ran. The descent from the ridge in darkness was disordered. Small groups formed and reformed, guided by memory and compass bearings. German troops pursued, firing into shadows and moving cautiously through unfamiliar terrain. Several skirmishes flared briefly as retreating Australians encountered forward German patrols. Engagements were short and violent, ending as quickly as they began. By 23:45 hours, the first Australian elements reached the beaches south of the pass. Naval vessels waited offshore with engines turning. Sailors urged speed. Men waded into cold water, lifting wounded above the surface, scrambling up rope nets onto destroyer decks. At midnight, April 25th, Brigadier Allen arrived with members of his headquarters. He refused immediate boarding until reports from his battalion commanders were received. Minutes passed under intermittent distant fire. Walker was brought in, wounded but alive. Others followed in scattered groups. Some did not arrive. Naval officers pressed for departure. Dawn would expose ships to air attack. At approximately 00:45 hours, the last destroyers cleared the shoreline, engines increasing speed as they turned southward. From the decks, survivors could still see intermittent flashes on the hills. Small groups remained behind, either cut off or unable to disengage in time. The 24 hours had been met. The rearguard had held, then withdrawn under fire. The cost would only be fully understood in the days that followed. Part 7. Resolution and Aftermath. The Price of Time. In the early hours of April 25, 1941, German forces entered the Thermopylae position in full control of the ground the Australians had held the previous day. They found shattered trenches, abandoned equipment, burned-out vehicles, and bodies left where they had fallen. The pass was silent except for sporadic movement, as patrols confirmed that the rearguard had withdrawn. The evacuation from southern Greece continued for several nights. In total, just over 50,000 British and Commonwealth troops were successfully transported to Crete and Egypt. Not all escaped. Thousands were captured during the wider campaign, but the destruction of the entire expeditionary force had been avoided. The Australian rearguard at Thermopylae paid heavily for that outcome. Of the roughly 2,000 engaged in the final stand, several hundred were killed, wounded, or captured during the fighting and withdrawal. Precise numbers varied in different reports, but losses were significant. The action ranked among the most costly engagements of the Greek campaign for Australian forces. Brigadier Harold Allen survived the withdrawal. After Greece, he continued service, later commanding Australian troops in New Guinea during difficult jungle operations. Lieutenant Colonel Walker recovered from his wounds and returned to duty. Other officers and men were not as fortunate. Some captured at Thermopylae spent years in German prisoner of war camps. Others were buried in Greek soil. Strategically, Greece fell to Axis control by the end of April. The campaign had been swift and decisive in territorial terms. Yet the evacuated formations did not vanish from the war. Many reassembled in Egypt. Elements of the Australian 6th Division later fought in North Africa, contributing to the Allied stand against General Erwin Rommel. The German Balkan campaign also carried broader consequences. The need to secure Yugoslavia and Greece delayed the launch of Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. Historians continue to debate the degree to which that delay affected subsequent events on the Eastern Front. What is clear is that resources and time were diverted southward during a critical period. In Australia, the events at Thermopylae became part of a larger narrative. April 25th already marked Anzac Day, commemorating the Gallipoli landings of 1915. The coincidence of dates deepened the symbolism. Once again, Australian soldiers had fought as a rearguard in a distant campaign, tasked with covering the withdrawal of larger forces. The comparison with the ancient battle at the same pass was frequently drawn. Yet the circumstances differed in one essential respect. The Australians were not annihilated. They fulfilled their mission and withdrew, preserving experienced troops for future battles. In later years, veterans returned to Greece. The pass, once filled with smoke and noise, stood quiet beneath the same mountains. Memorials marked the ground where the rearguard had stood. Greek civilians remembered assisting wounded soldiers who had become separated during the retreat, hiding them from occupying forces when possible. The action at Thermopylae did not alter the immediate outcome of the Greek campaign. It did not prevent occupation, but it achieved its limited objective. Time had been purchased. The cost was measured in casualties, in men missing from embarkation rolls, in names recorded on memorials. For those who boarded the destroyers and looked back at the dark coastline, survival carried a weight of its own. The significance of the stand lies not in victory, but in calculation and resolve. A rearguard was ordered to hold for a defined number of hours against superior force. It did so. That delay allowed tens of thousands to fight again in North Africa, in Europe, and later in the Pacific. The mathematics were severe. Hundreds bore the cost so that thousands could continue the war. Thermopylae in 1941 demonstrated that even in retreat, disciplined resistance could shape events beyond the battlefield. It showed that defeat in one theatre did not end the campaign when experienced formations were preserved. Decades later, one veteran described what remained in memory. Not speeches, not banners. The sound of artillery in a narrow pass, and the knowledge that the line had held long enough. History often remembers victories. At Thermopylae, it remembered endurance.